When high-profile CEO Amelia Harrington receives a mysterious text on her husband Andrew's phone while he's in the shower, she doesn't know her life is about to change forever. The soft hum of running water filled the ensuite bathroom, a soothing counterpoint to the crisp morning sunlight streaming through the half-drawn blinds of Amelia Harrington's bedroom. She stood by the bedside, absently scrolling through emails on her phone. Meetings, strategy updates, an urgent request from the CFO, another day in the whirlwind of running a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. Her husband Andrew's phone buzzed on the nightstand beside her. Without thinking, she glanced at the screen. It wasn't unusual for Andrew to get texts at odd hours. As a freelance architect, he worked with clients across different time zones. But this message was different. Short, personal, loaded. Everything's set for our getaway this weekend. I can't wait to see you. M. Amelia froze, the words burning into her mind. A familiar heat prickled her skin, a mix of irritation and disbelief. She stared at the phone, expecting it to buzz again, as though the next message might clarify what this one couldn't. A mistake, surely. People got numbers mixed up all the time. She shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to entertain the alternative. The bathroom door creaked open, releasing a gust of warm, citrus-scented steam. Andrew appeared, towel slung loosely around his waist, his brown hair dripping water onto his shoulders. "Morning," he said with a lazy smile, rubbing the towel over his head. "Your phone buzzed," Amelia said, keeping her tone light, neutral. Andrew glanced at the device but didn't move to pick it up. "Spam, probably," he replied, moving toward his closet. Amelia hesitated. Should she mention the message? Part of her wanted to toss the phone at him and demand an explanation. Another part reminded her that she'd been down this road before, reading too much into things, asking questions that didn't need answers. She opted for silence, turning back to her own phone as if the matter was already forgotten. The drive to work was uneventful, but the message lingered in her mind, resurfacing between calls and briefings. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Amelia had always prided herself on being rational, the kind of person who dealt with facts, not speculation. Facts, however, were scarce. Who was M? Why had Andrew not even glanced at his phone after the buzz? Was it guilt, or was she overthinking this, projecting insecurities onto him that belonged to her? Her assistant, Diana, interrupted her thoughts with a soft knock, holding out a thick file. "Quarterly projections," Diana said, her usual efficiency masking any concern for Amelia's distracted demeanor. "Thanks," Amelia muttered, taking the folder and trying to refocus. Numbers were easier than feelings. Numbers never lied. Later that evening, as she stepped into their house, the smell of roasted garlic and herbs wafted toward her. Andrew was at the stove, stirring a sauce. He glanced up and smiled, a boyish grin that had once made her weak in the knees. "Dinner's almost ready," he said. "Figured you'd be starving after your day." Amelia dropped her bag by the door, her gaze lingering on him. It was easy to dismiss doubts in the presence of his easy charm, his effortless warmth. Yet the message's words echoed in her mind, a faint but persistent whisper. "So," she began, leaning casually against the counter, "what's the plan for this weekend?" Andrew didn't miss a beat. "Same as usual. Probably catch up on work, maybe tackle the garage if I'm feeling ambitious." "Why?" She shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just curious." His response was quick, almost too smooth. If he was hiding something, he wasn't giving anything away. Later that night, Amelia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Andrew's steady breathing beside her was both reassuring and maddening. She replayed their interactions over and over, searching for inconsistencies, for clues. It wasn't like her to obsess over something so trivial, or so she told herself. But her gut told her this wasn't trivial. Andrew had always been a good husband, supportive of her relentless drive, patient with her erratic hours. If anything, he was the glue holding their marriage together, especially during the rocky patches. But lately, she'd sensed a distance between them, subtle but undeniable. Was this her fault? Her constant traveling, her late nights at the office, her endless meetings and deadlines, had they pushed him away? Or was the message simply a mistake, and she was chasing shadows in her own mind? The next morning, Amelia sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as Andrew read the paper across from her. "I got a weird text yesterday," she said casually, testing the waters. "Oh," Andrew didn't look up. Yeah, something about a getaway this weekend. Definitely wasn't meant for me. Andrew chuckled, finally glancing up. People send the strangest things these days, probably spam. She studied him, searching for a flicker of guilt, a telltale sign. But his face remained unreadable, calm. Amelia forced a smile. Yeah, probably, but her unease didn't fade. If anything, his nonchalance deepened her suspicion. As she left for work, she resolved to put the message out of her mind, to focus on the things she could control. Yet some part of her knew she wouldn't let it go. She couldn't, not until she had answers. The unease from the message lingered like a faint but persistent headache. Amelia tried to shake it off, brushing her hair and forcing her focus back to the glowing screen of her laptop. Reports, projections, and emails clamored for her attention, but the words from that mysterious text refused to dissolve. Everything's set for our getaway this weekend. I can't wait to see you. M. Amelia had dismissed it as a mistake. What else could it be? But as she watched Andrew emerge from the shower, towel slung around his waist, humming a tune she didn't recognize, the words replayed themselves in her mind. She clicked her laptop shut as he approached, catching his attention. "Hey, what's up?" Andrew asked, his tone easy. He rubbed at his damp hair with the towel, oblivious to the storm gathering in her thoughts. "Just working," she said casually, pausing for a moment before adding, "What about you? Any big plans for the weekend?" Andrew hesitated just briefly, but long enough to set off a silent alarm. "I've got a conference in Seattle. Late notice," he said, avoiding her eyes as he tossed the towel onto a chair. "You know how these things are. I'll probably fly out Friday evening." Seattle. A conference. It was plausible enough, yet the text implied something far more personal. She bit the inside of her cheek, debating whether to bring it up. Her rational side urged her to let it go. She had no concrete reason to doubt him. Yet the other side, the one born from years of small unnoticed fractures in their marriage, wouldn't let her rest. "Another conference," she said, her voice light, almost teasing. "Seems like you've been racking up those frequent flyer miles." "Yeah," he replied, a little too quickly, and then, as if to deflect, added, "Speaking of which, what about you? Any big plans for work this weekend? Another round of board meetings, maybe?" The deflection stung. She saw through it, but chose not to press, not yet. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, giving him a tight smile. "You know me. Always something to do." Andrew laughed softly, kissed her on the forehead, and disappeared into the bedroom to get dressed. Amelia stared at the empty doorway, her stomach tight with unease. The rest of the evening passed in strained normalcy. They had dinner together, exchanging surface-level updates about work and acquaintances. Andrew was relaxed, his usual charming self, yet Amelia couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence between his words. Later, after he'd gone to bed, Amelia found herself sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, but work was the furthest thing from her mind. Her gaze drifted to Andrew's phone, left unattended on the counter. She stood and reached for it, her fingers hovering over the screen. The text was still there, unanswered. It felt wrong to dig further, but the knot in her chest urged her forward. She swiped down to check for more messages from the unknown number, but found nothing else suspicious. The absence of more didn't reassure her. If anything, it made the message stand out even more, like a clue in a puzzle she wasn't supposed to solve. The next morning, Amelia decided to give herself the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps she was overreacting, projecting her guilt about their distant relationship onto a harmless situation. Andrew had always been supportive of her career, even when it consumed more of her time than their marriage. Maybe her feelings of inadequacy were clouding her judgment. But the nagging thoughts didn't disappear. As the week went on, small details began to add up. She noticed Andrew closing his laptop quickly when she entered the room, something he'd never done before. His study door, usually left ajar, was locked when she tried to bring him coffee one evening. When she asked about it, he said he'd been organizing old files and didn't want the cats knocking things over. A plausible excuse, but one that felt rehearsed. Her breaking point came on Wednesday evening. Andrew was in the study again, door locked, when Amelia heard the muffled sound of his voice. She pressed her ear to the wood and caught snippets of his conversation. "Yeah, Friday works. I'll make sure everything's ready. No, she doesn't suspect anything." The blood drained from her face. Amelia retreated to the kitchen, her mind racing. Was she imagining things? Misinterpreting? She couldn't even be sure he was talking about her. But the way he spoke, the casual certainty in his tone, felt like a betrayal in itself. Later that night, when Andrew kissed her goodnight and rolled over to sleep, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her heart ached with suspicion and something darker, a deep, gnawing sense of regret. In the quiet of the bedroom, she couldn't ignore the voice in her head that whispered all the ways she'd failed their marriage. Long hours, missed anniversaries, and the countless nights she'd prioritized work over intimacy. She hated how the doubt cut both ways, forcing her to wonder if she'd created the cracks Andrew might now be slipping through. But if there was guilt, there was also anger. By Thursday morning, Amelia had made a decision. She wasn't going to accuse him outright yet. Instead, she'd keep her eyes open, observe, and prepare herself for whatever she might discover. As she sipped her coffee and watched Andrew pack his briefcase, she smiled at him like everything was normal. But inside, a storm was brewing. She had no intention of letting this lie remain buried. By Friday morning, the unease in Amelia's chest had calcified into resolve. The days of uncertainty had drained her patience, and Andrew's hurried departure for his conference only fueled her suspicions. He'd kissed her on the cheek, promising to call, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. As she watched him drive away, the knot in her stomach tightened. Once his car disappeared from view, she returned to the kitchen and reached for her phone. A quick search led her to a discreet private investigator with a reassuringly low profile and stellar reviews. She hesitated for only a moment before dialing the number. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, offering none of the judgment she'd feared. By the end of the call, she felt both relieved and uneasy. Hiring someone to follow Andrew felt like crossing a line, but the alternative, continuing to live in the dark, was unbearable. While waiting for the investigator to begin his work, Amelia turned her attention to Andrew's phone, which he'd carelessly left charging in their bedroom. She told herself she'd only look for a few minutes, just enough to ease her mind or confirm her fears. Unlocking the phone was easy. She'd known his passcode for years. She navigated to his messages, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might drown out the silence of the room. The message from M was still there, as taunting as ever. Amelia hesitated, then opened the thread. Her breath caught when she saw the earlier exchanges. "Can't stop thinking about last time. Can't wait to see you again this weekend. It's all set. Let's make it unforgettable." Each message felt like a dagger. There were no names, no obvious references to what last time was, but the tone was unmistakably intimate. Amelia scrolled further, but found the thread stopped abruptly. No photos, no further clues. She checked his call history next. No saved contact for the number, but there it was, repeated several times in the last month. Late at night, during work hours, and even once while they were supposed to be having dinner together. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound of the front door creaking startled her. She quickly locked the phone and placed it back on the charger, her heart racing. It was only the wind, but it left her shaken. She realized how far she'd gone down this path of mistrust, and there was no turning back now. Later that afternoon, the investigator, a man named Paul, called with an update. Andrew had driven to a small cafe in a neighboring city, a place Amelia didn't recognize from his usual routine. Paul confirmed Andrew wasn't alone. "He's meeting a woman," Paul said, his voice matter of fact. "They've been here for about an hour. I've got photos if you'd like to see them." Amelia gripped her phone tightly, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "Send them," she whispered. When the photos arrived, Amelia felt her stomach drop. Andrew was sitting at a corner table with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was striking, with long dark hair pulled into a loose bun and an easy smile. They looked comfortable together, their postures leaning toward one another in a way that suggested familiarity. Paul's notes indicated this wasn't the first time they'd met at this cafe. Over the past 2 weeks, Andrew had been there multiple times, always with the same woman. Their meetings weren't long, an hour or two at most, but the frequency and secrecy were undeniable. Amelia stared at the images until her eyes burned, analyzing every detail. Was this woman someone from Andrew's past? A colleague? Or something worse? The uncertainty gnawed at her, each possibility worse than the last. That evening, when Andrew called to check in, Amelia struggled to keep her voice steady. He sounded normal, too normal. If he was hiding something, he was an exceptional actor. Amelia knew she couldn't keep this charade going much longer. The evidence was piling up, and while she didn't yet know the full truth, she'd seen enough to know something was deeply wrong. That evening, as she sat in their living room with a glass of wine, she tried to make sense of her swirling emotions. Was this her fault? Had her relentless focus on her career pushed Andrew away, or was this betrayal entirely his choice? Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. It was another message from Paul. "Just sent you a file. Thought you'd want to see this." Amelia opened the attachment with trembling fingers. It was a clearer photo of the woman with Andrew, taken from a different angle. She noticed something this time, a small bracelet on the woman's wrist, engraved with what looked like initials. The details were blurry, but it gave her something tangible to work with. If Andrew wouldn't give her the answers she needed, she'd find them herself. As the night stretched on, Amelia sat in the dim light of her living room, her mind spinning. The evidence she'd gathered pointed to a betrayal, but the full story was still just out of reach. And Amelia wasn't the type to leave any stone unturned. The file from Paul sat unopened on Amelia's laptop for several minutes, her cursor hovering over it as if opening it might unlock something irreversible. Her coffee sat untouched, cooling beside her. She felt the weight of her decision pressing down like an unbearable ache. Andrew's mouth opened slightly, then closed as he leaned back, sighing. "All right," he said finally, rubbing his temples. "You're right. I've been meeting Miranda, but it's not what you think." Amelia crossed her arms, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Then what is it? Because it looks a hell of a lot like you're sneaking around behind my back." Andrew shook his head, his voice soft but insistent. "It's not an affair, Amelia. Miranda is an artist, and I've been working with her on something special. For you." Her brow furrowed, skepticism flaring. "For me?" "Yes," he said, meeting her eyes with what seemed like genuine earnestness. "Our anniversary is coming up, and I wanted to do something memorable, something unique. Miranda is helping me create a custom piece, a sculpture that represents us, our journey together." The words hung in the air, clashing with the storm of doubt and anger swirling in Amelia's mind. "A sculpture?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Do you expect me to believe that?" After all the late-night calls, the secret meetings, I didn't want to ruin the surprise. Andrew interrupted, his voice rising in frustration. "Do you know how hard it's been to keep this a secret? I wanted to do something meaningful for us, but now you've twisted it into something it's not." Amelia stared at him, her chest tight with emotion. There was a flicker of plausibility in his explanation, just enough to plant seeds of doubt in her accusations. If he was telling the truth, had she just ruined what could have been a heartfelt gesture? But if he was lying, "Why didn't you just tell me you were planning something?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Why all the secrecy?" Andrew sighed again, his expression softening. "Because I wanted to surprise you. I know I've been distant lately. We both have. I thought maybe this could be a way to reconnect, to remind us why we started all this in the first place." His words cut through her anger, leaving her conflicted and vulnerable. She wanted to believe him, desperately. Yet something about the situation still didn't sit right. Miranda's name, her bracelet, the tone of the messages, it all felt too personal, too intimate for what Andrew was describing. "Why didn't you tell me about her sooner?" Amelia asked, her voice quieter now. "Why not mention you were working with someone?" "Because I knew how it would look," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know how crazy our schedules have been, and I didn't want you to think I was just wasting time on some side project. I thought you'd appreciate it once it was done." His explanation felt rehearsed, yet his tone carried a vulnerability she rarely saw from him. Amelia sat back, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. Had she misjudged him, or was she falling for a carefully crafted lie? "I need some time to think," she said finally, standing and moving toward the kitchen. She didn't wait for his response. The rest of the evening passed in silence, the tension between them palpable. Andrew retreated to his study, and Amelia poured herself another glass of wine, replaying their conversation in her head. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the man she'd built her life with was still someone she could trust. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at her resolve. If Miranda truly was just an artist, why had Andrew been so guarded about her? And why did the messages feel so much more personal than professional? That night, as she lay awake in bed, Amelia made a decision. She couldn't confront Andrew again without more evidence, and she couldn't let herself be swayed by his words alone. If she was going to find the truth, she'd need to dig deeper. Whatever this was, whether a thoughtful gesture or a web of lies, she wasn't done unraveling it yet. The confrontation with Andrew left Amelia restless, her thoughts swirling in a storm of confusion and doubt. His explanation about Miranda, a collaborative effort for a surprise anniversary gift, had sounded plausible enough, but something about it felt off. She couldn't ignore the intensity of the messages or the unmistakable familiarity between them in the photos. The pieces didn't fit. Andrew had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion after the tense exchange, but Amelia's mind refused to rest. She sat in the dimly lit kitchen with her laptop open, a mug of now cold tea beside her. If Andrew wouldn't give her the whole truth, she'd find it herself. She began with Miranda Ellis. A quick search brought up a series of articles and interviews, each painting her as a talented yet relatively obscure artist with a flair for abstract sculptures. Her work had been featured in a few local galleries, and her social media showcased her creative process, images of rough sketches, tools strewn across a cluttered workspace, and finished pieces proudly displayed in minimalist settings. At first glance, Miranda's life seemed ordinary. But as Amelia scrolled through older posts and articles, a new layer began to emerge. An article from 6 years ago caught her attention, a small feature on a startup Miranda had co-founded with 2 partners. One of those partners was Andrew. The revelation hit her like a slap. Andrew had never mentioned Miranda in any context, not as a friend, a colleague, or a former business partner. Amelia clicked through every link she could find, piecing together fragments of the past. The startup had been a tech art fusion project, blending interactive sculpture with cutting-edge software. It had launched with high hopes, but fizzled out within a year due to lack of funding and internal disagreements. Andrew's name appeared in a handful of articles, always mentioned briefly as one of the co-founders. There were no details about what had gone wrong or why the project had failed, but the connection was undeniable. Why hadn't Andrew told her about this? Had he kept it from her intentionally, or had it simply slipped his mind over the years? Either way, the omission felt significant. Amelia's curiosity deepened. She dug further, her search leading her to obscure financial reports and legal filings related to the defunct startup. One document mentioned a settlement, an agreement to resolve a dispute between the co-founders over intellectual property rights. Andrew's name was there again, listed as a recipient of the settlement. Her heart raced as she clicked on another link. It led to a database of public financial records where she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Andrew had been making regular transfers to an account she didn't recognize. The amounts weren't astronomical, but they were significant enough to raise questions. The most recent transfer had been just 2 days ago. Amelia stared at the screen, her mind reeling. She and Andrew had always kept their finances relatively transparent, yet here was an account she'd never heard of, linked to a series of unexplained transactions. It didn't take a leap of imagination to connect the dots. Miranda and the failed startup were somehow tied to this hidden flow of money. Was Andrew paying Miranda for her work on the supposed anniversary gift? Or was this something more sinister, hush money to keep her silent about a shared secret? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she debated what to do next. Part of her wanted to wake Andrew and confront him with everything she'd found, to demand an explanation for the lies and omissions. But she knew better. If Andrew had been hiding this for years, he wouldn't crack so easily. She needed more. Amelia's phone buzzed, startling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Paul, the investigator. "Found something interesting. Can we talk?" She immediately called him, her voice tense as she said, "What is it?" Paul's tone was calm but serious. "I've been looking into Miranda, like you asked. Turns out she's not just an artist. She was listed as a co-founder of a startup your husband was involved in years ago. It didn't last long, but there's more to the story." Amelia gripped the phone tightly. "I know about the startup. What else did you find?" "There's a pattern," Paul said. Miranda went through some financial trouble after the company folded. Debts, a lawsuit over unpaid studio rent. It wasn't pretty, but things started turning around for her a few years ago. Around the same time, Andrew started making those transfers. Amelia's heart sank. "You're saying he's been supporting her?" "It looks that way," Paul replied. "But here's the thing. The account receiving the transfers isn't registered to Miranda directly. It's under the name of a holding company." "A holding company?" Amelia repeated, her voice rising. "Why would he use something like that?" "It's hard to say," Paul admitted. "But it's not unusual for people to use holding companies to obscure transactions. Could be for tax reasons or other reasons." Amelia's mind raced. If Andrew was funneling money through a holding company, it meant he was going to great lengths to keep the payments hidden. The question was why. "Thanks, Paul," she said, her voice heavy. "Keep digging." She ended the call and stared at her laptop screen, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in her mind. The connections between Andrew, Miranda, and the hidden account were undeniable, but the motives remained murky. Was Andrew supporting Miranda out of guilt over the failed startup? Or was there something deeper, something more damning? As the hours ticked by, Amelia's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let Andrew's web of lies control her any longer. Whatever he was hiding, she would find it. And when she did, there would be no room for excuses. The next morning, Amelia stood outside a small, sunlit art studio, her hands trembling as she gripped the strap of her handbag. Miranda's name was printed neatly on the sign above the door, alongside a swirling logo that mirrored her abstract artistic style. Amelia had rehearsed this moment in her mind a dozen times on the drive over, but now that she was here, the words seemed stuck in her throat. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of paint and sawdust, a combination that felt strangely inviting. Sculptures of varying shapes and sizes lined the walls, their curves and angles drawing the eye in unexpected directions. Behind a cluttered workbench, Miranda stood, her dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, her hands smudged with clay. The artist looked up as the door creaked shut, her face registering surprise at the sight of Amelia. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Amelia stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. "I'm Amelia Harrington," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Andrew's wife." Miranda's eyes widened, and for a brief moment her composure faltered. But she recovered quickly, setting down the clay she'd been molding and wiping her hands on a nearby towel. "I figured this might happen eventually," she said quietly. "I suppose you have questions." "You could say that," Amelia replied, crossing her arms. "Let's start with the truth. Who are you to my husband?" Miranda sighed and gestured toward a small seating area near the window. "This might be easier if we sit." Amelia hesitated, then followed her to the chairs, her heart pounding as she prepared herself for whatever Miranda was about to reveal. Miranda sat down and clasped her hands in her lap, her expression conflicted. "Andrew and I met years ago, as you probably know by now. We worked on a startup together. It was an exciting time, but it ended badly for all of us." Amelia nodded stiffly. "I know about the failed company. What I don't know is why you've been meeting him in secret, or why he's been sending you money." Miranda exhaled deeply, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to Amelia. "This isn't easy to say, but Andrew and we had a relationship before he met you. It ended when the company folded, and we went our separate ways. I moved on, or so I thought." Amelia's chest tightened. "Go on." "About a year after the company dissolved," Miranda continued, her voice soft, "I found out I was pregnant. Andrew didn't know, and by the time I considered telling him, he was already with you. I didn't want to disrupt his life or yours, so I raised my son on my own." Amelia stared at her, the weight of the revelation sinking in like a stone in her stomach. "Your son," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Miranda said, her gaze steady. "Pawn. His name is Jonah. He's 14 now." Amelia felt like the ground beneath her had shifted. The images of Andrew and Miranda meeting at the cafe, walking in the park, they all took on a new, heart-wrenching context. "So the text about the getaway," Miranda nodded. "It was about spending time with Jonah. Andrew's been visiting us for the past year, getting to know him. Jonah didn't even know who his father was until recently." The room seemed to tilt as Amelia struggled to process the information. Andrew, the man she'd built a life with, had been hiding a child from her for over a decade. The implications were staggering, not just for their marriage, but for the carefully crafted image they'd presented to the world. "Why didn't he tell me?" Amelia asked, her voice breaking. "Why keep this from me?" Miranda's expression softened. "Because he was afraid. He thought you'd leave him, or worse, that you'd resent Jonah. He didn't want to risk it." The words stung, cutting deeper than Amelia expected. She prided herself on her strength, her ability to handle anything life threw at her. Yet Andrew had made a decision that excluded her entirely, based on an assumption that she couldn't handle the truth. Amelia stood abruptly, pacing the small space as anger and betrayal bubbled to the surface. "So, what? He sneaks around, throws money at you, and expects me to just go on believing everything is fine?" Miranda rose, her expression calm but firm. "It's not about the money. He's been trying to do right by Jonah, to be the father he should have been from the start." "And what about me?" Amelia shot back, her voice rising. "What about our marriage? He lied to me, Miranda, for years." Miranda didn't flinch. "I don't condone how he handled this, but if you're here, it means you care enough to want answers. That's a start." Amelia stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping as the weight of it all threatened to crush her. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, more to herself than to Miranda. "That's for you to decide," Miranda said gently. "But Jonah didn't ask for any of this. He's a good kid, and he deserves a chance to know his father, and maybe, one day, you." Amelia turned to face her, the anger in her eyes giving way to exhaustion. "I don't know if I can forgive him." Miranda nodded, her expression empathetic. "Take your time, but whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with." Amelia left the studio feeling hollow, the weight of the truth pressing down on her with every step. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at the dashboard, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. Andrew had lied to her, yes. But he'd also been trying, clumsily, desperately, to make amends for a mistake that had shaped his life in ways she was only just beginning to understand. The question now was whether she could find it in herself to forgive him, to move forward knowing that their marriage would never be the same. As she started the engine and pulled onto the road, Amelia realized she didn't have an answer yet. But she did know one thing. This was only the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that would determine the future of their marriage, their family, and the life they'd built together. Amelia's drive home from Miranda's studio felt like a blur, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. By the time she pulled into the driveway, a quiet rage had replaced the initial shock. She sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she steadied her breathing. Andrew's car was parked in its usual spot, a frustratingly mundane reminder of the man who had turned her world upside down. He was home early, likely expecting a quiet evening. Amelia pushed the door open and walked inside, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Andrew was in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a smile that faded when he saw her expression. "Hey," he said cautiously. "You're home early, everything okay?" Amelia didn't answer right away. She dropped her bag on the counter and crossed her arms, fixing him with a piercing stare. "We need to talk." Andrew set his glass down slowly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "All right, what's this about?" "You know exactly what this is about," Amelia said, her voice low and controlled, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "I went to see Miranda." Andrew froze, his hand still resting on the counter. "You what?" "I talked to her," Amelia continued, stepping closer. "I know everything, Andrew, about Jonah, about the money, about the lies." The color drained from Andrew's face. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words. "Amelia, I can explain." "No," she cut him off sharply. "You don't get to explain. Not after hiding something this big from me for 14 years. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to hear about your son from someone else? To piece it all together because you couldn't be honest with me?" Andrew flinched, but held his ground. "I didn't tell you because I knew how you'd react," he said, his voice rising. "You're always so focused on appearances, on maintaining this perfect image. I was afraid of what this would do to us." "That's your excuse?" Amelia snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. "You lied to me, Andrew, for years. How am I supposed to trust you after this?" Andrew's frustration boiled over. "I didn't lie to hurt you," he said, his tone sharp. "I was trying to protect us. Do you think it was easy for me? Knowing I had a son out there, not being part of his life? I was trying to fix it, Amelia, but I didn't know how." Amelia shook her head, her hands clenching into fists. "You don't fix things by keeping secrets. Do you have any idea how this feels? To realize that I don't even know the man I married?" Andrew's expression hardened. "And do you know how it feels to come second to your career every single day? You're so consumed with work that you barely notice what's happening around you. I didn't tell you about Jonah because I knew you'd see it as a problem to be managed, not a human being who needs his father." The accusation hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. "That's not fair," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't put this on me. You made this choice, Andrew. You're the one who lied. And you're the one who checked out of this marriage years ago," Andrew shot back. "We've been living like strangers, Amelia. You're more married to your job than you are to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Amelia's eyes burned with unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall. "You think I don't care about us?" she said, her voice breaking. "I've sacrificed so much for this life we built for you. And I've sacrificed too," Andrew said, his tone softer now, but no less pained. "I've made mistakes, Amelia. I know that, but so have you. We've both let this marriage fall apart in different ways." The room fell silent, the weight of their words settling between them like a barrier neither could cross. For the first time in years they were both fully exposed, their flaws and fears laid bare. It was raw, painful, and terrifying. "I don't know how we come back from this," Amelia said quietly, her arms dropping to her sides. "I don't know if we can." Andrew stepped closer, his expression conflicted. "I don't have all the answers, but I know I don't want to lose you. I didn't know how to tell you the truth without losing everything." Amelia looked at him, searching his face for some sign of the man she'd fallen in love with. She saw flashes of him there, his vulnerability, his sincerity, but the cracks in their relationship felt impossibly wide. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "to figure out what this means for us, for me." Andrew nodded, though the pain in his eyes was evident. "Take whatever time you need. Just don't give up on us, Amelia, please." She didn't respond, instead turning and walking toward the stairs. Her heart ached with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was faint, fragile, and buried beneath layers of hurt, but it was there. As she climbed the stairs, she realized that the road ahead would be anything but easy. Trust would need to be rebuilt, conversations would need to be had, and choices would need to be made. But for the first time in a long time, Amelia felt like she wasn't running on autopilot. She was awake, fully present in the messy, complicated reality of her life, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward healing. The house was unusually quiet in the days following their argument. Andrew kept to himself, working late in his study or retreating to bed early. Amelia found solace in long walks through the neighborhood, using the crisp evening air to clear her thoughts. Each step felt heavy, weighed down by the enormity of what had transpired. Her emotions swung wildly: anger, sadness, betrayal, but also guilt. She couldn't stop replaying Andrew's words, "You're more married to your job than to me." The truth in that statement stung. She'd always prided herself on her work ethic, on building a career that gave them both security and stability. But somewhere along the way, she'd let it overshadow everything else, including their marriage. She spent hours reflecting on the woman she'd become. The one who barely noticed when Andrew stopped waiting up for her at night, or when the small gestures they used to share, morning coffee, lingering hugs, faded into routine. She couldn't excuse his lies, but she could see now how they'd both contributed to the growing distance between them. On the fourth day, she decided she couldn't avoid him any longer. She found Andrew in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary but hopeful. "We need to talk," Amelia said softly, sitting down across from him. He nodded, setting the remote aside. "I've been waiting for you to say that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, but it felt less suffocating than it had in their earlier confrontation. "I've been thinking a lot," Amelia began. "About us, about everything that's happened." Andrew leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I'm still hurt, she admitted. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive the lies, but I also can't ignore the fact that I haven't exactly been the best partner either. His brow furrowed, guilt flickering across his face. Amelia, let me finish, she interrupted gently. I've been so focused on my career that I didn't see what was happening to us. I let the distance grow, and I didn't do enough to bridge it. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it helps me understand why you felt you couldn't come to me. Andrew nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her. I should have trusted you. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was make things worse. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared regrets hanging between them. I want to try, Amelia said finally, her voice steady. But it has to be different this time. No more secrets. If we're going to rebuild this, I need to be part of your whole life, including Jonah. Andrew's eyes widened, his expression shifting to one of cautious optimism. You're sure? I'm sure, she said, though the thought of meeting Jonah still made her heart race. He's your son, Andrew. If we're going to make this work, I can't pretend he doesn't exist. Relief washed over Andrew's face, and for the first time in days, Amelia saw a flicker of the man she'd fallen in love with. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I know this isn't easy for you, but it means everything to me. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Andrew reached out to Miranda to explain the situation, and they arranged for Amelia to meet Jonah over lunch at a local park. Amelia felt a mix of nerves and anticipation as the day approached, unsure of what to expect. When the day finally arrived, she dressed carefully, choosing a simple sweater and jeans in an effort to appear approachable. Andrew drove them to the park, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as they neared their destination. You don't have to do this if you're not ready, he said as they pulled into the parking lot. I'm ready, Amelia replied, though her heart was pounding. This is the first step. They spotted Miranda and Jonah near a picnic table under a large oak tree. Miranda gave them a small wave, her expression neutral but kind. Jonah, a lanky teenager with dark hair and Andrew's piercing blue eyes, stood beside her, shifting uncomfortably as they approached. Hi, Amelia said, her voice tentative. You must be Jonah. The boy nodded, his eyes flicking between her and Andrew. Hi. There was an awkward pause before Miranda stepped in. Why don't we all sit down? I brought sandwiches. As they settled around the table, Amelia couldn't help but study Jonah. He was quieter than she expected, but there was a confidence in the way he held himself that reminded her of Andrew. She noticed small details, a freckle on his left cheek, the way his hands fidgeted with the hem of his hoodie, that couldn't have made him anyone but her husband's son. The conversation started slowly, with Andrew asking Jonah about school and Miranda chiming in occasionally. Amelia listened carefully, unsure of how to insert herself into their dynamic. But as the meal went on, she found herself relaxing. Jonah was polite but reserved, answering questions with a shy smile that hinted at a warmth just beneath the surface. When the meal was over, Jonah wandered toward the nearby playground, leaving the adults to talk. Miranda excused herself to take a phone call, giving Amelia and Andrew a rare moment of privacy. Well, Andrew asked, his expression nervous. What do you think? Amelia watched Jonah climb onto a swing, his legs pumping as he tried to gain momentum. I think he's a good kid, she said finally. You've done a good job, Andrew. Both of you. Relief spread across Andrew's face, and he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you for giving this a chance, for giving us a chance. She squeezed back, a small smile tugging at her lips. It's going to take time, but I'm willing to try. As they sat together, watching Jonah swing higher and higher, Amelia felt a cautious sense of hope. Their marriage wasn't fixed, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in years, she felt like they were on the same path, walking toward a future that was imperfect but real. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. And for Amelia, that was enough. The story of Amelia and Andrew reminds us that trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild, but not impossible. Relationships are complex, filled with moments of connection and fracture, and it takes courage to face those cracks head-on. Whether it's learning to forgive, embracing vulnerability, or taking that first step toward healing, we all have the power to rewrite our stories. If this story resonated with you, Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more thought-provoking tales that dive deep into the human experience. What would you have done in Amelia's situation? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And remember, every story has the potential for a new chapter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.